This knife has a straight edge on it, so it's very easy. And maybe in our world here, there lives a happy little mountain.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin. I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding like true crime videos. I do mystery, unsolved disappearances, murders, anything along those lines, as well as a little bit of like university and lifestyle videos sprinkled in where I can. Today I'm finally back and it seems a little bit weird filming. It's actually only been a week since I filmed, but all of last week I had to take off filming because I managed to catch the freshest flu, which ended up in me actually completely losing my voice for like a week. It's still coming back, it's much better now. It sounds a little bit husky now, but I feel so much better. But last week I honestly sounded like, I don't even know what I sounded like. I sounded dreadful. Very quickly before we start, I just want to say a huge thank you for 100,000 subscribers. That's insane. I'm not going to say too much because in the vlog that I'm filming this week, so this weekly vlog which will go up next week, I kind of gushed a little bit, so I don't want to gush in this video as well. But this is the first video going up since I hit 100,000. I actually hit 110,000 I think a day or two ago, which is insane. It's always been a dream of mine, so I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you, and I hope I don't disappoint you with any of my content. So today I'm back with, I think this is going to be quite a long video. I'm actually doing another kind of serial killer video. It's not super unknown, but I didn't really know personally like this loads of the details of the case. So today we're going to be talking about the serial killer couple known as the Barbie and Ken Killers. So yeah, like I said, I'd kind of heard about them before, but I didn't really know the extent to which their crimes reached. And there is a lot of information, so I'm just going to say very quickly here that I'm sorry that I might miss some details, I might miss some attacks or names or something, but there is a lot because the couple had such a long crime spree, but also they have a lot of background, especially Paul Bernardo. There's a lot of background to cover, so I'm sorry if I miss a few details. Honest mistake, I don't mean to offend anyone. I'm just trying to do the best I can with so much information. Also, just a very quick disclaimer, this video does talk about kind of sexual assaults and just kind of violent attacks, so if that sounds like something that you don't really feel comfortable with, then definitely don't watch this video. It's not for you. It's quite a heavy video, so yeah, just thought I'd put that little warning in first. So the Barbie and Ken Killers were a serial killer couple, or a serial killer duo, who over kind of a span of a number of years, just before their marriage, during their marriage, they worked as a team to lure in a number of young girls into kind of their home or secret locations where they would rape, torture, and even in some cases murder them. And in particular, Paul Bernardo, his crime kind of list, his list of victims is extremely long. It even kind of spans back before he met his future wife. So there's a lot here. Barbie and Ken Killers were Paul Bernardo, who was known as the Scarborough Rapist, and then a young woman named Karla Homolka. In terms of their background information, I have quite a lot of information on Paul Bernardo. He had quite a seemingly dramatic and kind of dark childhood, so I'll definitely go into a little bit of detail about his childhood. There isn't as much information on Karla's background because kind of all the reports just say that she pretty much had a normal childhood. She seemed like a very normal, happy young girl. So Paul Bernardo was born on August 27th, 1964 in Scarborough in Canada. And he started his criminal life much earlier, or at least his kind of dark fantasy life much earlier than Karla Homolka did. From a young age, Paul saw his younger sister, her name was Debbie, and also his mum to an extent, fall victim to their abusive father. So he did kind of fall victim to his father in the sense that he was physically abusive towards him and he would verbally abuse him a lot, but his younger sister and his mum would also suffer, unfortunately, from sexual abuse as well as physical and psychological abuse. So Paul's father was known as being particularly violent, especially towards pretty much all of his romantic partners, but it is recorded that he was particularly violent towards his current one, which was Paul's mother. And it also came out at some point in the timeline that his father was abusive to a number of young girls around Debbie's age. So Paul watched his father sexually abuse his younger sister for many years. However, while Paul was a teenager, he actually learned that this man who he thought he was his father, this abusive man that he kind of watched abuse his loved ones, was actually not his real father, and that his mother had had an affair with one of her exes at some point during their relationship, and this man was his real father. After finding out that this abusive man wasn't his father, but his mother had lied to him for maybe 16 odd years, he began to act out quite severely, and kind of all of these factors mixed in together led for a very, very negative outlook on women. He began showing very, very aggressive signs, aggressive attitudes towards women. In particular, he became very, very openly insulting and verbally abusive towards his own mother, because as much as she had also been the victim of abuse, in his eyes, she had also lied to him for many years. So, I mean, this was quite a dark early start in life, and yes, he did have quite dark and negative feelings towards women. He did have a kind of seemingly normal life past that. You know, he did well in school, he went to college. In college he was quite popular with women, so he had a lot of girlfriends, although they wouldn't really be kind of serious girlfriends, because a lot of the time they would be over quickly, since he was, you know, he'd start displaying kind of abusive tendencies towards them. But he was a very good looking, popular man. It is relevant to mention the fact that everyone kind of says that Paul Bernardo is an extremely good looking man. He was charming, and this is kind of where the media later coined the term the Barbie and Ken Killers, because both Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were extremely, extremely attractive. In 1982, when he was just in his early 20s, he began working for a company called Amway, and while he was here he picked up a number of sales techniques kind of that he'd watch other colleagues doing things, and things that were taught, really, techniques for sale, like ways of encouraging people to buy things, pretty much convincing people. So he became obsessed with these sale techniques and how to almost apply them to other aspects of his life. People who know him at the time said that he became kind of obsessed with these like get rich quick programs and watching motivational talks on entrepreneurism, and it was this very much like he wanted to be rich and famous, and he wanted it to be through kind of charm. And like I said, he was a particularly charming man, so he'd spend a lot of his free time kind of in bars with his friends, just picking up women. He was really successful in the kind of romantic front, because he would apply, like I said, these like sale tactics to pick up women. And then in 1987, Paul Bernardo met his future wife, Karla Homolka. They met in kind of a social environment, and their connection, like their strong connection to each other, was mainly based on sexual compatibility. And it's also worth mentioning that at the time of their first meeting, Karla Homolka was only 17 years old. So up until this point, like I said, Paul had kind of displayed these aggressive behaviours towards women, kind of abusive tendencies, but usually, I mean, there'd be a limit. So as you can imagine, women would kind of go, okay, this is too far, this is too aggressive, this is too scary. One of his main interests was the idea of publicly shaming women, and he had obviously tried to apply this in sexual contexts with previous partners, but it hadn't always gone to plan, and people would ultimately end up shaming him for it, because it's kind of scary. And therefore it was extremely unlikely for him to meet a woman who would actually kind of encourage this behaviour, not only towards herself but towards other women. However, Karla Homolka was in fact that woman. Rather than shame him or turn him away, Karla appeared to encourage his abuse, not only towards herself but also towards other women, and it kind of seems to be what made their relationship work. I will mention that, however, there was kind of a point where she didn't always encourage, as you can imagine, she wouldn't encourage his abuse towards her in extremely violent manners. So there were times where she would be hospitalised or nearly hospitalised, and obviously she wouldn't be encouraging it then. But to the most extent, she kind of seemed to encourage his aggression. There's one particular fact that I thought I would just chuck in here. It's kind of, I don't know how true it is, but it is shared by a lot of media reports. They made a claim that he had a known interest with a book called American Psycho, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. It's kind of like a cult classic, it's a big deal, but apparently he had kind of this obsession with it, and he carried it around with him everywhere. He used it almost like his Bible, so he would refer to it for guidance, and just his own morals would be based on this book, which is obviously a little bit concerning if you know what the book's about. So now on to the actual list of sexual assaults carried out on behalf of both Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. In terms of the actual timeline of all the sexual assaults, there is no way of knowing whether this is the full timeline, whether there were some that kind of weren't ever reported to the police, or even just some that were believed to have been carried out by someone else that were actually carried out by Paul Bernardo. So I'm just going to start with the known, or at least semi-confirmed, believed to be confirmed, sexual assaults that Paul Bernardo carried out from the year of 1987, which was the same year that he met Karla. On May the 4th, 1987, Paul Bernardo stalked and began following home a 21-year-old woman in Scarborough, and it ended up with him following her to her parents' house, where he sexually assaulted her outside of the home. On May the 14th, 1987, he assaults a 19-year-old woman in her parents' back garden. On July 17th, 1987, he attempts to assault a young woman, and after beating her quite severely, she did manage to fight back and ultimately escape. On September 29th, 1987, he attempts to assault a 15-year-old girl in Scarborough. So he broke into her parents' house, broke into her bedroom, he jumped on top of her while she was in bed and kind of knelt on her back so she couldn't really move. He covered her mouth so that she couldn't make a noise, and he also held her at knife point. However, the assault was interrupted when the victim's mother managed for some reason just to walk into her daughter's room and obviously saw what was going on. She screamed loudly and Paul just escaped, leaving her only with a bruise on her neck and a bite mark. There was actually a man who was wrongfully convicted of this attempted assault, but he was released in 2006 after Bernardo's eventual confession of being the person who perpetrated this assault. On December 16th, 1987, he sexually assaults a 15-year-old girl, and it was around this time that investigators began sort of linking these crimes together, and the media coined the term the Scarborough Rapist. On December 23rd, 1987, he holds a 17-year-old girl at knife point and sexually assaults her. On April 18th the following year, his sexual assaults continue and he sexually assaults a 17-year-old girl. On May the 30th, 1988, he sexually assaults a young girl in a place that I can't pronounce, so I'm going to put it on the screen. It's around 25 miles away from Scarborough. On October 4th, 1988, he attempts to sexually assault another woman in Scarborough. He manages to stab her twice in the thighs, but she manages to fight him off and get away before any more pain is caused. On November 16th, 1988, he sexually assaults an 18-year-old woman in her parents' back garden. And then the following day, the official task force is set up in hopes of hunting down the man known as the Scarborough Rapist. On December 27th, 1988, he attempts to sexually assault a woman. However, a neighbour heard her scream and kind of heard the kerfuffle and manages to chase him away before he attacks her. On June 20th, 1989, he attempts to assault another woman, but this time she manages to fight back, so she scratches his face quite badly and actually managed to scream loud enough for her neighbours to be alerted, so they managed to chase him away. On August the 15th, 1989, he spots a 15-year-old girl in a bus shelter. He ends up following her home and ultimately sexually assaults her. On December 22nd, 1989, he sexually assaults a 19-year-old woman. And then on May 26th, 1990, he sexually assaults another 19-year-old. However, this time she managed to catch a glimpse of her attacker, enough to remember enough details to actually provide the investigators with like a composite sketch. So this facial sketch went out to every newspaper in the area, every media outlet, everything, like everywhere they could possibly get this face out there, because they believed this was the face of the Scarborough Rapist. So following this, a number of people around Scarborough kind of sent in loads of anonymous tips saying who they thought it looked like. And there were actually a couple of tips from people who knew Paul Bernardo saying that he fit the sketch pretty well, but because you have to remember at this point it was a public search for the Scarborough Rapist, so they had loads. That you can only imagine how many tips they had coming in, so all they could do at this point was kind of go through all the tips and make a list of everyone that could potentially be a suspect. And then in July of that year, detectives made their way down the list to Bernardo and they ended up calling around his house for an interview, just kind of to see if there's any potential reason for him to be a suspect in the case of all these attacks. So Bernardo, as you can imagine, was particularly charming and chatty and witty towards these detectives. He was really friendly towards them, so he invited them in his house, he made them drinks, he kind of had a chat with them. He did provide a DNA sample to them. He kind of said, like, he offered one to them. They took it, obviously, but because of the way that he acted around them, they kind of walked away from his house and pretty confidently said, actually, we don't think he could be the rapist because he was this nice guy. He seemed to know what he was doing. He seemed to know all his alibis and things. So they, at that point, didn't think he was a very high up suspect. So up until this point, obviously, the focus has been on Paul. Karla does have a little bit of an interesting backstory, so I'm going to go a little bit into Karla's backstory, but like I said, there isn't as much, especially criminal activity in early Karla's life. So Karla Homolka was born on May the 4th, 1970 in a place called Port Credit, also in Canada. She was known as a smart, pretty, confident girl who was well liked. She was pretty popular among her peers in school, and she seemed pretty driven, like she seemed to be striving for quite great things in her life. When she was young, she began displaying kind of a great love and passion for animals, caring for them, and then she ended up taking a job in a veterinary clinic just after school. So she kind of began her training as a veterinary nurse. And in retrospect, like I said, everyone who knew Karla said that they would have no reason to suspect the dark things that she would later be capable of. Throughout the crimes carried out by Bernardo after the time that they'd met, Homolka would give her approval. She would almost kind of help him in a sense. She would say which ones she thinks were a good idea to assault, who should be the next victims, ways that he should go about it, things like that. They actually ended up getting engaged only 2 months after meeting, so not all of these attacks that I just kind of listed through Bernardo's timeline were ones that she was a witness for, but a lot of them she would kind of be a part of. So as I'm sure you can tell, there was a lot of things that Bernardo did with the aid of Homolka, but then the real kind of media covered, the big attacks were ones that Homolka was definitely a lot more directly involved in, which is what I'm going to go on to now. So in the year of 1990, Bernardo and Homolka were living in Homolka's family home with her parents. They were saving up a little bit of money so they could end up moving in together and buying their own place. And around Christmas time of 1990, Homolka aided the sexual assault which ended up in the death of her 15-year-old sister named Tammy. This particular is the crime that was more kind of covered by the media. This is the one that they are particularly known for because Homolka helped Bernardo attack her own sister. So Bernardo had allegedly been kind of obsessed with the fact that Karla, as much as, you know, they were happy in their relationship, she wasn't a virgin, and she wasn't a virgin when they met, so she couldn't give him her virginity, and he was allegedly kind of more and more obsessed with this. And it got to a point where he actually started obsessing over Tammy, her 15-year-old sister, who obviously was a virgin, and she would help him like spy on her. She would tell him where she was undressing, things like that. It was really creepy, things like that, until it got to a point where she felt so guilty that she couldn't give him her virginity that she helped plan this sexual assault on her. So Karla ultimately agreed to help Paul sexually assault 15-year-old Tammy, and this took place on December 23rd of that year, when the Homolka family were throwing a Christmas party in their home. Karla had stolen a bunch of drugs from the veterinary clinic that she works at, including an anaesthetic that was to be kind of administered as a way of drugging her and making her unconscious so they could, you know, move her wherever they wanted to carry out the attack. So Karla would spike Tammy's strength throughout the night, kind of in small doses so that no one else would notice, and then at the end of the night, when everyone else in the family had gone to bed, all the guests had left, and Karla ended up being unconscious, they ended up dragging her down into the family basement where they began their attack. So they took her down to the basement. She was obviously quite drugged up pretty much, and this is when they held a soaked cloth. The cloth was soaked in another drug, so it was more anaesthetic, against her mouth so that ultimately she, like I said, would become unconscious. Paul then proceeded to sexually assault Tammy, and he actually ended up encouraging Karla to take part, which she did. So she also assaulted her younger sister, and all the while they were filming the attack. However, during the attack at some point she began sort of waking up, and she began vomiting because of all the drugs and everything. She just started vomiting and started choking. So the pair kind of panicked because she seemed to be having this really weird reaction. So they frantically dressed her, they called emergency services, and she was taken away saying that she had kind of just gotten too drunk, and they gave them the impression that it was like self-induced illness. She was a bit of a party girl. Sadly, she died on Christmas Eve of 1990. The drugs that they had given to her didn't show up in her autopsy. They went unrecognised in the system, so they got away with it. Not long after Tammy's death, the pair actually moved in together. So like I said, they'd been saving up for their own home. They moved in together, and this would only encourage their aggressive attacks even more because they had their own location to do it. It's said that around this time, Bernardo became even more abusive towards Tammy because not only was she working obviously to keep their house and things, so he said that she wasn't like around enough anymore for her to actually be there for him in a sexual manner and just in every other manner. He also showed some resentment towards her for what he believed was her fault. So he believed that in a sense she was the one that killed Tammy. And because Karla was kind of a little bit more absent, like I said, she was working a lot more, He believed that she owed him another young girl, so they focused their attention onto their next victim. They had a young friend whose name was Jane. She was a little bit younger, and she was said to almost idolise Karla. She looked up to her, and so when Karla invited her out for dinner, just the two of them, Jane was almost excited. She was like, oh yes, she was excited. She was looking forward to having dinner with this woman who she idolised. And just as she'd done with Tammy, she spiked her drinks through the night and ultimately invited her back to hers and Paul's home, just kind of seemingly innocent. And it follows a very similar pattern to what they had done to Tammy. So when they got Jane back to their home, they drugged her once again and proceeded to sexually assault her. And this sexual assault also was filmed, so they had more and more, like they were collecting more and more physical evidence of their attacks. This time Jane woke the next morning, so obviously she'd been drugged but nothing had happened. So she'd woken up the next morning completely unaware of the ordeal that they'd put her through that night. She woke up kind of sore in places, but she had no idea of what they had done to her, and she just simply went home unaware of what they had done. And then because this attack was successful in their eyes, they continued their attacks. So Bernardo kind of just kept moving on to his next victims because he seemed to just be getting away with it more and more, and he could act out his increasingly dark desires. So there was another sexual assault in January of 1991 that Bernardo carried out by himself. So he assaults a young girl and then he kind of leaves her deserted in a place, it was like a road, an empty road near a place called Lake Gibson. So that again was him carrying out another sexual assault on his own. On April 6th, 1991, a 14-year-old girl was Bernardo and Homolka's next victim. Karla had been the one to almost lure this young girl into their car. She'd flagged her down asking for directions. She was stood by a car like waving at this 14-year-old, trying to get her to come over because she needed help. And that's when Bernardo appeared out of nowhere and dragged her into a nearby bush. He continues to sexually assault her, and then he forces her to hide in the bushes until he manages to disappear out of sight. And then on June 29th, 1991, it's when Karla and Paul get married. They had a particularly extravagant wedding. All the reports, if you look into sort of what their wedding was like, it was really, really extravagant. They had a lot of flowers, they spent a lot of money on it, there was a lot of guests. I think they even rode in on like a horse and carriage. She wore like a big extravagant gown, so it was a big deal. And it was actually on this same day that law enforcement officials discovered a body, which would later find out to be another one of their victims. On their wedding day, the body of a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Mahaffey was found. She'd been dismembered and encased in concrete and dumped into a lake. Bernardo had kidnapped Leslie on June 15th outside of her home by forcing her into his car, which is where he drove her to their home, and that's where both him and Karla sexually assaulted her for around 24 hours. Karla later claimed that Leslie had died after Bernardo had strangled her with an electrical cord twice, after the first time only left her unconscious. However, Bernardo claimed that he wasn't actually in the room when she died, and that it must have been Karla who killed her because he had left the room to go and prepare his car to transport her wherever they were going to kind of ditch her, because obviously the plan was for her to just be unconscious until the next morning. So he claimed that he went away to sort the car out, work out what he was doing, came back in the room and picked her up to carry her to the car, and that's when he noticed that she'd actually died. He even went as far to say that he apparently tried to resuscitate her, but obviously she was already dead, so they were unsuccessful. The next day he moved her body into the basement because they were expecting Karla's family to come around for the day, so he hid her in the basement and kind of left her there just while they were entertaining their guests. They had to prevent anyone from going into the basement, obviously they were hiding a body. And then after they left, Paul dismembered her body and encased her in concrete so they could go and dispose of her body without it ever linking back to them. Homolka later said that she hadn't been present for when he had dismembered the body. She was unaware he'd done this because she'd been at work the whole day, and this was backed up by her work logs. So after investigators discovered her body in the lake, they were able to identify that it had been the body of Leslie Mahaffey because of her dental records. Then the next attack is almost unconfirmed. So in March of 1992, a man named Robert Baltovich was convicted of murdering his girlfriend, but his defence lawyers actually made a claim during the trial, saying that it was actually the Scarborough Rapist who carried out the murder of his girlfriend and not him, and that he should be deemed as not guilty. He was initially convicted, but then in 2004 his appeal was granted and he was found as innocent. On March 29th, 1992, Bernardo began stalking two sisters while they were walking home. So he followed them to his parents' house. He was kind of stalking them in his car, but he was also taking photos or filming them outside of his car, like through his car window. So they actually spotted him because of the camera. They incorrectly remembered his number plate, so they made a report, but obviously no correct match could have been found to Bernardo's car because they remembered it incorrectly. However, the next month, one of the sisters had been out just walking around when she'd spotted Bernardo, the man that had been stalking her, just out and about town. I think he was going to pick up some dinner. So she this time followed him. She this time managed to nearly correctly remember his number plate, and she was able to file an official report saying that she knew the true identity of her stalker. But strangely enough, this information was actually mishandled by the police. Apparently around this same time, a number of reports and pieces of information were mishandled and lost by the police. So yeah, nothing ever came of that. Unfortunately, that could have been the discovery of the Scarborough Rapist of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, but the report was lost. The next victim was 15-year-old Kristen French, who they kidnapped outside of a church on April 16th, 1992. They managed to lure her into their car, again with Karla asking for directions. They took her back to their home and continued to sexually assault her, and this is also another attack that they filmed. Kristen French managed to survive the ordeal, and it kind of looked like they were going to release her. But then on Easter Sunday, they were about to leave for a family dinner at Karla's house when they went down into the basement and they murdered her. Her body was then found on April 30th in a ditch. And then at the end of 1992, police had managed to make an advance in kind of going through all the DNA evidence that had been provided by all of the potential suspects that had, if you remember, come through from tips of the Scarborough Rapist. So like I said, 2 years before this, Bernardo had invited detectives into his house and he'd offered a DNA test, and they'd only just managed to get round to testing each of these samples from each of these potential suspects. So at the end of 1992, they began testing these, and it took them a little while to sort of get through them all. Then in January of 1993, things kind of took a bit of a turn for Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo's relationship. They ended up separating in January because Karla Homolka left him pretty much. She claimed that she could no longer take the abuse that he was giving to her. She said that he'd become increasingly aggressive towards her in more recent months, and she felt like she had no choice but to end their relationship. So the case against the Scarborough Rapist had kind of been building up at this point. There was an increasing amount of information, like DNA and things. They were getting seemingly closer to discovering the true identity of the Scarborough Rapist. Both Karla and Paul had come across the radar of the police investigators a number of times, just kind of more for interviews. So like when Tammy died, obviously they were both interviewed. There hadn't seemed to be any strong suspects, but they had come across the radar, only this sort of made them a lot more known amongst the police investigators. So yeah, their attention started focusing a little bit more on Karla and Paul because of an incident which ultimately led to Karla leaving Bernardo. So the incident in which he abused her so badly, she ended up checking herself into a hospital because he had abused her pretty badly. But she'd checked in under the pretenses of being in a car accident. So she kind of followed this story, she made this story up, but then it was actually some concerned co-workers of hers that didn't believe her. They were worried that it was abuse, and so they called her parents, who then asked her about it, and she ultimately reported him. So she filed some serious assault charges against Bernardo. She moved out of the house, and he was arrested for battery charges, but he was later released. And then finally in February of 1993, police who were testing through all the DNA evidence that they'd collected like 2-3 years before, they finally managed to reach Bernardo's DNA evidence, and they managed to match him as being a potential match for the Scarborough Rapist. So he becomes a high-level suspect, and they place him under 24-hour police surveillance because it's not the only thing that they can arrest him on, so they kind of wanted to watch him in hopes of seeing anything that might implicate him even further. While he was a high-level suspect, they brought Karla in for questioning on February the 9th, and she almost avoided anything in relation to his crimes. So she avoided talking about his crimes. She would change the subject onto his abuse of her. She would kind of just emphasise the fact that how badly he abused her and things, and didn't really give much information about his crimes, his potential sexual assaults. And then it was after this interview, so on the same day, she ultimately confessed to her aunt and uncle about the extent to which Bernardo had not only assaulted her but all of his sexual assaults while she was with him. During her confession, she then also said that there were tapes to prove that she wasn't lying. And at this point, she met with a lawyer actually in hopes of, she was kind of planning on confessing officially to police investigators, but she was worried about the trouble that she would get, and obviously she would probably be in just as much trouble as Bernardo would be. So she met a lawyer and kind of hoped that he could fight for her to get immunity in the trial if she provided any information, like if she cooperated, if she found the tapes and things. So he went away, spoke to a few people, but because of the tapes not only featuring Bernardo, but they featured her sexually assaulting these victims, they said that ultimately full immunity would be impossible. On February 17th, they had very little evidence kind of linking Bernardo to the crimes. So they had his DNA and they had Karla's confession, but they wanted kind of a little bit more solid evidence. So they managed to arrest him, and they also managed to get a search warrant, but this search warrant was very limited in what they could do in the house. So the search warrant stated that they could enter Bernardo's house and they could do a search, but they weren't allowed to remove anything from the home. They weren't allowed to report anything for their case if they hadn't expected to find it. And also any tapes that they did find inside the property, they would have to watch inside the property. It actually took them 71 days to do a complete search of the home because they were very limited in what they could do. So obviously they weren't allowed to ransack the house, they weren't allowed to damage anything, so they had to be very, very careful. And it took them 71 days, which is crazy. But the only tape they managed to find was a very short clip of Karla performing a sexual act on a young woman. They couldn't tell from this tape alone that it was a sexual assault, so it could have potentially been something that was consented, so there wasn't really a lot they could go on, and it only at that point implicated Karla. They did, however, discover a handwritten diary that Bernardo had been keeping, in which he had written down in detail each one of his attacks. So despite having only a little bit of evidence against him, police investigators were adamant that they had the right man in custody, and he was ultimately charged with the attacks, so the rapes and murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. On May the 5th, Karla Homolka was offered an insane plea bargain, so she was offered only 12 years imprisonment. If she had refused the plea bargain, she would obviously have a much longer sentence because she would be implicated in I think a mixture of first degree and second degree murders, as well as a number of other things. So her actual sentence, what her sentencing should have been, would have been much longer. I don't know how they came up with the 12 years plea bargain, but that is insane. People have kind of ever since then openly outraged against how little this sentencing is. For the amount that she was involved in these crimes, it's insane. But at this point, she almost had played investigators a little bit by giving them the impression that she hadn't been that involved, that he'd forced her because he was abusing her, and that she wasn't consenting in any of these attacks. It wasn't until the eventual discovery of the videotapes when they actually realised just how much she had been involved in these crimes, so just how willing she was to attack these young girls and just how dark she could be. But by this point the plea bargain had already been agreed upon, so she had already been in prison for 12 years. They couldn't do anything about it, which is just, every time I hear it, like every time I think about that, I think that's insane. On September 1st, 1995, Paul Bernardo's trial ended with him receiving a guilty verdict on a lot. So I'm going to read it out to you. So he received a guilty verdict on all counts of manslaughter, kidnapping, unlawful confinement, aggravated sexual assault, first-degree murder and dismemberment, and as you can guess, he received a life sentence. Then on July the 4th, 2005, Karla Homolka finished her sentence. She served her 12 years in prison and she was released. She was given quite strict restrictions on what she could and couldn't do once she was released, so including she couldn't contact Paul Bernardo at any point while he was in prison, she couldn't contact any of the victims' families, and so technically she did serve her sentence, but she did have to face public outrage. So obviously everyone at this point knew just how cruel she was and how lightly she got off on all these crimes, but she actually was very strongly involved in, and she did have to live her life in public with all these people knowing who she was and what she'd done. There was a number of scandals revolving Homolka while she was in prison. There was a rumour of her having an affair with a fellow inmate, a convicted bank robber, so there's a lot of drama around her while she was in prison. Just before Homolka's release, Bernardo actually confessed to a lot of his crimes, but he maintained the fact that he had never wanted to kill any of them. So he had said that he had always been the one who wanted to just kind of carry out the sexual assaults or the assaults and then let them go free. But it was actually Homolka who insisted on murdering some of them in order to protect their identities. Now, if you're wondering about the actual videotapes that showed the extent to which they attacked these young girls, they were actually ultimately destroyed. So there was an appeal heard about whether they should keep them for evidence or whether they should destroy them, and it was agreed upon that they had no reason to exist any longer, that they were disgusting or awful, there was no benefit to them existing, so they were destroyed. So poor Bernardo remains in prison while Karla Homolka lives her life as a free woman. She's actually remarried now, which I think is crazy that she is still free. In 2017, Bernardo appealed for parole, but he was denied. And there was also some scandal about him potentially being charged with possession because he had been found allegedly with a homemade shank in his prison cell, but those charges were dropped. And that's kind of the last update we have on either of them. So yeah, this is a very long video. That's where I'm going to end things. I think this entire thing is crazy. I think these are two very twisted people. And yes, I am glad in a sense that Bernardo is still imprisoned. However, I think there is a lot of injustice there with Homolka being free woman, and I think a lot of you will share this opinion. So let me know down below what your thoughts are on all this. I think all of this is absolutely disgusting, and it's crazy just how much they did, really, just how much harm they caused. Let me know down below if there are any cases you would like me to cover. I hope you guys found this interesting. I'm sorry that I am still a little bit ill, but I hope you guys still found it okay to watch. I will see you guys very soon for another video. Bye.